Debt Jubilee, economic nirvana or nightmare? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over some history. A debt jubilee is actually very, very common when you go all the way back to even biblical times. But the most referenced debt jubilee that I could find in doing some research was the London Debt Accord of 1953. This was between several countries, most notably the United States and the UK. They were the creditors, and Germany was the debtor. 50% of the debt got completely wiped out. This was private and public sector debt. Couple keys here. Number 1, all the creditors were external, corporations and countries outside of Germany. Also, these creditors really were incentivized to help West Germany out. They wrote down that debt because they didn't want West Germany to fall into communism. It would potentially prevent future altercations, and remember, they just got out of World War II, and it would be a great trading partner if West Germany was able to stabilize their economy and really start to grow. It was kind of like a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, a restructuring of the debt. The big difference is that the equity didn't get wiped out. They're the same owners, same managers, but there were some interesting details with the London Debt Accord that made it very unique. To dive into those details, let's go straight to the internet. First, I think it's crucial to point out where the debt came from. This will really apply to step number 2 when we compare what happened in Germany to what might happen here in the United States in the future. The German debt came from 2 periods, before and after World War II. Before World War II, it was the money they borrowed to try to pay back what they owed from the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. These were huge legacy reparations forced on the country after the defeat of World War I. The other half of the debt originated from Reconstruction following the end of World War II. Remember that. It's very important we realize the debt really didn't come from consumption. It didn't come from the Germans going out and buying $100,000 cars or $1 million properties they couldn't afford, or levering up to buy stocks and bonds. It came from just a total annihilation of their entire country. And here I want to point out once again, the creditors to West Germany were keen to stabilize the country's politics and economics so that it could be a bulwark against communism. This unique political reasoning led to the creditors adopting a much more enlightened approach to dealing with the country's debt. There are 4 main components of the debt restructuring. First, setting limits on debt payments. Most ingeniously, and we got to remember this website I'm reading from is very pro-debt jubilee. So we got to kind of take their editorial comments with a grain of salt. But most ingeniously, it was agreed that West Germany's debt payments could only come out of a trade surplus. If the country had a trade deficit, no payments would need to be made. This meant it only made debt payments using revenue it had actually earned, rather than having to resort to new borrowing or using up FX reserves. It prevented a return to a crisis or long stagnation. And I think you could also plug in stagflation there. Might be even more appropriate than stagnation. Second, it included all types of creditors. So all types of creditors were bought into the restructuring, whether foreign governments or companies outside of Germany. Number 3, it included all debts owed, not just government. The London Debt Accords addressed all debts owed by the West German economy to people, governments, and companies in other countries. It therefore included debts of German individuals and companies, not just those in the government. Number 4 is they used negotiations, not sanctions. And it goes back to looking at this as kind of a quasi Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We're going to get into a lot more details in step number 2 and step number 3, but I wanted to go over this quickly so you understand that debt jubilees are actually very common throughout history, and a lot of economists think they're an extremely valid solution. Step number 2, today's debt jubilee. There's several different opinions from economists all over the world how this would play out and what the best approach is for a debt jubilee. What I think is the most probable outcome is a very slow type of inflation that would gradually wipe away the debt. It wouldn't be a one-time debt restructuring like Germany in 1953. And the way we get that inflation is by MMT helicopter money and the Fed being the buyer and lender of last resort. Now let's look at some numbers. First, $75 trillion in total debt in the United States, private and public sectors, according to the Fed. Private, we've got a chart here showing that it's right around 14 trillion. The graph is a little old, so I added a couple trillion on there. Who knows? It could be higher. We're adding just trillions on a weekly basis. The public debt, of course, right around 24 trillion, but what's interesting is the way it's broken down. Editor, throw up a pie chart of the public debt. The Federal Reserve owns about 11%, the U.S. government 27%, mostly in the Social Security Fund. U.S. investors 32.5%, and foreign investors almost 30%. The big difference here compared to 1953 with Germany is that the foreign creditors were very motivated to restructure Germany's debt. It was in their best interest. Can we honestly say now that countries like Japan and China, who hold a lot of U.S. treasuries, it's in their best interest to restructure the debt and take a haircut? I don't think so. So you can't really compare 1953 with today when you look specifically at the United States debt, because we've got this external debt where the creditors don't want to take a haircut, and most of the debt in total is what we owe to ourselves. So do we really want to default on U.S. investors? Do we really want to default on the Social Security Fund? And of course, corporate debt is also at an all-time high, over $10 trillion. So how do I see this playing out? Well, we've got the Fed, the primary dealers, the corporations, hedge funds, financial institutions, and pension funds. Notice the balance sheets of these entities can be complete opposites. The debt on one balance sheet can be a liability. The debt on the other balance sheet can be an asset. As an example of this, XYZ Corp could issue debt. They could sell their corporate debt into the market. The buyer might be the pension fund. Okay, well, the debt is going to be a liability to the corporation, but it's going to be an asset to the pension fund. And of course, as we know, the Fed won't let any entity in the financial economy take a haircut. Therefore, if the corporation is not going to pay back their debt, or if they need a debt jubilee, the Fed will print up funny money, give it to the pension fund to make sure they are paid in full. The loan goes onto the balance sheet of the Fed. It's an asset. Then if the corporation doesn't pay back the loan, it doesn't matter anymore because the Fed doesn't have a profit or loss. When the Fed is done with these transactions, moving over to the right, the balance sheets change substantially. Instead of being debt on the liability side of the corporation, now you've just got equity. And instead of the loan being on the asset side of the pension fund's balance sheet, now we've just got cash. And I want to point out that, in my opinion, the Fed wouldn't just pay them 100 cents on the dollar. They would pay them 100 cents on the dollar plus whatever interest they would have earned over the entire maturity of the loan. So say they've got a 10-year corporate bond. Well, if they would have made let's say 20% interest in total over the life of the bond, the Fed would pay them 120 cents on the dollar. I think this is one way the Fed is going to indirectly bail out the pension funds, therefore the states as well. While this is happening, the government is spending money like a drunken sailor. Of course, they're issuing more treasuries into the market, and the Fed is buying as many treasuries as they need to make sure interest rates are low. I think the Fed pegs the yield curve just like they did in World War II. So we've got the green helicopter of cash right over here. The pilot is none other than Insolvent Sam, who of course could be your uncle. Insolvent Sam, who is usually drunk, is making it rain on the real economy. The BSC, or the bastard stepchild, that's how I think the Fed sees the real economy. Just over there in the corner, it's just a nuisance that they wish they didn't have to deal with. That stupid real economy always bothering us, always creating these problems. So your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam is making it rain, the helicopter money, or MMT, on the three people in our real economy. But it's really just the table scraps. It's nothing compared to the trillions and trillions of dollars the Fed is printing for their buddies in the financial economy. But notice the balance sheet of those individuals in the real economy doesn't change at all. They don't go from having debt on the liability side of their balance sheet to equity. It just goes from debt to just the same amount of debt with just some table scraps. That's the big difference between the real economy and the financial economy. The financial economy is always going to be taken care of by the Fed, and the real economy, not so much. So I think the government and the Fed combined, they're going to tag team this. They try to create consumer price inflation, which really isn't good for the individual consumers, the average Joe and Jane. It doesn't improve their standard of living. If anything, it decreases their standard of living, but it reduces the debt load for not only the government, but the other entities in the private sector, and it reduces the debt load for those individuals in the real economy who are levered up with credit card debt, mortgage debt, what have you. Again, it's a gradual process over 5-10 years where they reduce the debt in the entire system by, call it 50%, not through a restructuring, but through inflation. But there's several economists that think if the government and the Fed took this approach, it would be the wrong thing to do because they're not clearing up the balance sheet of the average Joe and Jane in the real economy. Most notably, Steve Keen, great economist, my good buddy. We interviewed him for the Rebel Capitalist show. He's done a lot of work on debt jubilees. And he thinks you've got to clear up the balance sheet of the consumer. It doesn't really matter if you clean up the balance sheet of the financial economy. For more on this, let's go right to a recent report he's done on his website, profstevekeen.com. Here's Steve's prescription. A modern Jubilee would create fiat money the same way as quantitative easing, but it would direct the funny money into the accounts of the public with the requirement they first use the money to reduce their debt. Debtors whose debt exceeded their injection, or how much money they got from the Fed, would have the debt reduced but not eliminated. While at the other extreme, recipients with no debt would receive the total cash injection into their account. So Steve suggests the Fed prints money, gives it to the retail banking sector. So we've got retail bank X, Y, and Z. Debtor Dan is with retail bank X. Normal Norm is with retail bank Y. And Prudent Peter is with retail bank Z. We look at their balance sheets right below them. In this case, Debtor Dan has $10,000 worth of debt. Norm has $5,000. Peter, of course, has no debt whatsoever. So the $10,000 payment from the Fed goes onto the balance sheet of each of these individuals in the real economy. Obviously, their balance sheet changes substantially. After the $10,000, debtor Dan, his balance sheet is pretty much clean. Normal Norm, he's got an extra $5,000, and Peter has an extra $10,000. While at the same time, the financial economy, that of course the Fed cares so much about, they get paid because Dan and Norm have to pay off their debt first before a penny goes into their checking account. And in the upper right-hand corner, we've got the professor himself giving us the big thumbs up. Yes, this is the way the system should work, says Professor Steve Keen. He's got his leather jacket and, of course, a can of Vegemite, as any good Aussie should have on them at all times. And Steve, if you're watching, buddy, I have no idea why I made it look like you're 250 pounds. I promise you, the next time I draw you as a stick figure, you'll be a nice, lean, slim 165. A big concern I have with a tops-down approach, though, is that it could create a lot of moral hazard and a lot of unintended consequences. But if we're trying to predict the future on what's most likely to happen, I think we've got to assume that a tops-down approach is what the Fed and the government is going to try to do. For more on this, let's go right to a recent interview with Ray Dalio, and you'll see exactly the mindset of the global elites.
This has happened in almost every single debt crisis. And the way the way to handle it is to let it run its course and let people feel the consequences of bad lending or good lending to the point that you don't disrupt the economy, that you don't hurt the economy much. That's why we look at what are systemically most important entities. If you start to see credit differentiation, that's a good thing, because then safe behaviors will be rewarded and reckless behaviors will be penalized by the marketplace. But you must not let that go beyond the ability to get past in that. So the question is, what's systemically important for the economy in a whole, and make sure that that doesn't pass through. That's the standard, most appropriate policy.
So they see the problem as being solved just as long as you get the right person in charge of the entire system. As long as you have the right central planner, then everything is good to go. Well, from my standpoint, or the Austrian standpoint, I don't think any central planner is going to do as good of a job as the free market. Step number 3! We've seen a debt jubilee in the past. We know what my opinion is of how it would look today, and what Professor Steve Keen says the government and the Fed should do to handle the problem of too much debt. But let's take it a step further, look into the future, and see how this could evolve. I've been giving it a lot of thought lately, and I'm not saying this is going to happen or this is a prediction, but I am saying that this is a possible logical conclusion to what the Fed and the government will do, assuming their game plan is to try to eradicate the debt through inflation. And to get inflation, we have to have money supply in the broad economy increasing. In other words, more debt with higher velocity. I'm assuming they're going to take the Japanese approach because that's the path of least resistance. And as we know, in today's society, they want to do whatever they can to avoid short-term pain, even if it means making the future a lot less bright. So the Fed comes in and they're the buyer of last resort. They're the lender of last resort. The retail banks are now just pretty much a brick and mortar location that originates loans. They don't keep anything on their balance sheet. Exactly what they're doing now with Fannie and Freddie, except eventually the loans just go straight to the Fed's balance sheet. And we're going to use a home in this example, but when I'm talking about a loan, I'm talking about credit card debt, student loan debt, auto debt, you name it. I think it's all going to the Fed's balance sheet, or at least I think that's definitely probable. The probabilities are higher than zero, let's put it that way. So in this example, this fine-looking gentleman right here in the middle buys himself a house. He pays $100,000 for this house, and let's just say that he puts down 50%, gets a loan for 50%. So that $50,000 loan goes through the retail bank, but they immediately sell it to the Fed before the ink's dry. So the loan goes onto the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. It's now an asset. In the future, I think it's possible this gentleman would then get a Fed card, we'll call it, and it's just like a credit card or a debit card, and it's got his $50,000 of equity directly on the card. He doesn't have to get a loan through the bank, no line of credit, no HELOC, no cash out refi. He's got the equity immediately on his Fed card, so he can go out and spend his equity at will. This increases the credit in the system, therefore the debt and the inflation. And you may be asking yourself, yeah, okay, George, I get it, but how does this guy get a card so fast? The bank didn't check his credit, his job, basically his ability to pay. But keep in mind, the Fed's BS is completely infinite. They don't care whether the loan on their books goes down in value by 50%. They don't care if they're getting paid. They don't have a profit and loss. It's on their balance sheet, but it's so much different than if the loan were on the balance sheet of a retail bank or any entity in the private sector that actually had to care about the loan going bad. Oh, but wait, there is more. This is really when it gets stiff drink time for sure. I think what could happen is the Fed card could be attached to some real-time data, such as Zillow. So if the comps go from 100,000 up to 110,000 or 120,000, the additional equity would immediately go to the home buyer's Fed card. So they could wake up one morning, look at their Fed card, and it could have an additional $20,000 balance on it just because Zillow, or the real-time data they're using for the Fed card, says the comps went up by 20%. So then the next question, of course, becomes, well, what if the value of the home goes down? But this is where it gets interesting. Not like this isn't crazy enough. But I think what would happen is the Fed would go back to being the buyer of last resort and the lender of last resort. In this case, if the homeowner couldn't sell their home because no one wanted to buy it at the $120,000 mark, well, they would just go right back to the bank and they'd give the bank the keys. No problem. It wouldn't affect their credit score. It wouldn't affect them in any way. They've already spent the $120,000. Now the retail bank is in charge of maintaining the home. The Fed pays them a fee, and the retail bank originates a new loan 6 months later to a new home buyer that's ready to buy the house at $120,000. And why wouldn't they? Because the Fed will give them a guaranteed loan and they'll buy it in case they ever want to sell. And let's keep in mind, this new buyer can get the loan easily because he has a great score. And you may be saying to yourself, George, I thought the credit score didn't matter. I thought the job didn't matter. The ability to pay was irrelevant because the Fed's BS is infinite. They don't care about a profit and loss. Ah, yes, but I said score, not credit score. I think what will determine whether or not the new buyer gets the loan will be their social score, not their credit score. So is a debt jubilee economic nirvana or an economic nightmare? I think my answer would be, in the short term, I see how it can be nirvana. boom, slate is clean, especially if the Fed or the government does it like Steve Keen suggests. But my concern is long term, it would be a nightmare. Think about this. Although you're wiping out the debt, you're adding a lot more future purchasing power. So in the long run, I think it could be very inflationary, especially if the Fed is backstopping anything and everything, so it prevents everyone from having downside loss. Well, if it prevents everyone from having a downside in the stock market, the housing market, whatever you're buying, I think the velocity picks up substantially. But that's taking it to a whole nother level above and beyond what Professor Keen is talking about. But also the unintended consequences, the moral hazard. Look at what has happened in our system since 2008, or even going back to 1987, the late 80s with Greenspan. Since then, our economy has been so deformed and it's been perverted so much by the Fed put artificially low interest rates and money printing. What would happen if we went through a debt jubilee, even if it worked short term? I'm just not convinced more central planning will work out long term. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And I want to give a quick shout out to the person who was awesome enough to suggest this topic for today's video. The Hutch Report on Twitter. Their handle @TradingBandit. Check them out, guys. And Hutch Report, I appreciate the suggestion. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.